Right then, proceeding with the debate, we'll be sending timestamps on the Zoom chat. However, please keep a timer to yourself at all times. With the motion that reads that developed countries should pursue a policy of degrowth, starting the debate, first affirmative speaker. Here.
I was muted. Sorry. Okay. 3, 2, 1, let's go. The culture of overconsumption and overproduction has adversely affected the lives of not just people who live within developed nations, but also businesses and people who reside in developing nations and are forced to subscribe to the economic standard that is upheld by these rich nations. Obviously, on side affirmative, we don't have fiat because this is a should debate, but we are allowed to imagine a couple of things about the model. The first is that we accept that there are differing implementations insofar as developed countries operate differently. We will defend the case of degrowth, even in the case in which people may make mistakes, or sometimes economic planners will not always be the smartest individuals in the room. Second, this looks like increased taxation in luxury goods, limits on emissions, the scaling of large industries that make up most of our consumption and production. But the last important thing to note is that this debate is a third-party assessment of how this will benefit local and global economies, even if we agree at the end of the day that this may adversely affect, for example, the economy of developed nations. We agree that that is important in the interest, for example, of things like sustainability, of protecting our environment, of ensuring that the average developed worker, for example, in the developed nation will be able to pursue and self-actualize in other matters of their life as opposed to just economic or professional interests. The first thing I want to argue is, why will this be done well? The first thing I want to prove is that developed nations have the capacity to do this well. First level, they have manpower, so economic advisors, financial planners who can be responsible for financial forecasting, drafting, for example, potential policies, ensuring, for example, that at the state or the federal level or even the local level, this can be done and enacted such that all the policies and implementations and audits can be done. Second of all, we have information, technology, and frameworks that allow us to imagine the most optimal form of the policy, for example, in which we perform the growth when it comes to different aspects of the economy, whether it be with regards to emissions, whether it be with regards to setting up a new special economic zone, and other things like that. What this means is that developed nations, for the mass majority of instances, have the means to plan and do it well. And they have the means to cascade and justify this act of degrowth towards different stakeholders, whether it be consumers, whether it be businessmen, whether it be non-government organizations. The second thing I want to prove under this argument is that they have the incentive to do it properly. So the first incentive is there are a lot of economic incentives. The government, for example, does want to experience severe economic shocks. We understand that the process, for example, of having shorter work weeks, of heavy taxation, may have weird economic results, and this is probably what the negative is going to argue later on. But this is precisely why, for example, this will not be done rapidly. This will not be done without a lot of like economic forecasting and foresight, which, as we proved in the first part of the argument, they have the capacity to do so. The second part is democratic interest. They don't want people to starve, for example. A lot of the individuals or the people in government who will be enacting this are people who have an affinity for people in the labor force, for people who are minorities, for poor people, for example. And often they're also beholden to their constituents. So insofar as all of those incentives, they don't have the incentive to do this terribly, meaning there is no incentive to have scandals or, for example, do this poorly. And often when funding is chosen or where we will cut funding, we'll cut funding from the less utile projects, for example, SpaceX, NASA, military, World Cups. Why will people respond to this well? The first part of this is that often there are a lot of cultural trends right now, which is rejecting corporate structure, the American dream, for example, the overconsumption, overproduction of the developed world. So an example of this, for example, is the culture of quiet quitting. Second of all, a lot of these people are generally more receptive because as the world liberalizes and progressivizes, people become more understanding that we need to have a stronger environment policy, stronger labor policy. People should stop working 5 times a week. But third of all, there are a lot of pro-democrat parties and progressive organizations, especially those who advocate on environment or labor issues, that are powerful and ubiquitous enough to back up this and fight against all the Republicans and other people that may be against degrowth. But lastly, even if some people would be angry at this, some of these people have other interests that compel them to not be staunch advocates against degrowth. So, for example, Republican or moderate politicians may not want to be perceived as against the people, against emissions, etc., because it's bad for the image. But for the people that will do this, they'll probably do it either way and are unchanging. We want to prove that in spite of that, it's still worth it. The argument proves broadly that the implementation of degrowth is not rapid, not haphazard, and will be supported by a large majority of people in these developed nations. The second thing I want to argue is that we want to combat the culture of growth and all of its adverse effects. Growth often is done at high speed and high volume globally. The first thing I want to prove is it's bad for developing countries. One, a lot of these developing nations have to keep up with developed countries and supply them via exports because they're the point A or point zero, for example, for a lot of raw materials. So, for example, we supply the US for tech, for example, a lot of their devices. We supply them with textile and cotton for a lot of the fast fashion brands. Second, often this forces laborers in developing countries to live under unfavorable circumstances. Things that not taking breaks, being forced to go overtime, conversing, divorce, rise, and a lot of other things, we still face the terribleness of not having a lot of these things. For example, many of our red onions are small and quite rotting in grocery stores because a lot of them were exported towards other countries for their own produce and consumption. But conversely, on the end of developed countries, that's quite bad for them as well. First, it's often about overconsumption and wastage. The fact that a lot of bananas and milk, for example, are thrown down the drain just because they don't look appealing to consume. And people in developed nations kind of overestimated how much money how much food, for example, they needed to, import or get from other countries in order to supply all the people in their nation. Second of all, there's a prioritization of economic and professional interests over other things. For example, people feel the need to work to the bone at the expense of having unhappy families, having no life outside of work, having no hobbies or no personal interests. But third, it often perpetuates inequality in similar methods as it exists in developing nations. Degrowth rectifies all of this. The first thing it rectifies is the culture of overconsumption. We would suggest broadly there's less wastage, which is good, which means that a lot of the produce that is done by the hard work of farmers, for example, doesn't necessarily go down the drain, quite literally. Second of all, we keep resources in their origin states that locals can benefit from, either as consumers or as producers in local markets. But second, we rectify the culture of the hustle. Bosses, for example, impose less mandate that force people to deprioritize other aspects of their life. Second, people can pursue other interests and hobbies. For example, spend more time with their children, work on their failing marriages, and other things that may make them happier and more self-actualized individuals. Third, broadly, insofar as it makes them happier, it might also make them productive individuals, so they're better to participate in the economy. The negative criticism, or the criticism from side negative rather, is that degrowth compromises other economic interests. Having jobs, maybe people have the right to consume and buy all the things they want. But the first thing we want to say as a form of preemption is that this will not be as economically terrible as you think it is. First, economic importance is often a secondary issue. These are developed countries that benefit from stronger welfare systems, better poverty threshold, etc. So if we're really discussing whether or not we want to mitigate the propensity of poverty or less economic benefits on developed nations in comparison to developing nations, we would prefer to protect the interests of those in developing nations, or even the poor and the working class within developed nations. Second of all, this is not necessary. There's a large part of our consumption culture access that's the larger problem. Third, this is necessary to ensure that our future economy is stable. Fourth, even when degrowth doesn't fully work out now, we still benefit from the research, making future forms of growth easier to act upon in the future, because at the future, we know where to start, how to draft and enact these policies, we know what went wrong, and therefore what not to replicate in the future. But what we will say is that it will also be worse in the future. We want to posit that the necessity for degrowth is inevitable. Eventual climate crisis, massive food shortage, mass resignation, for example. Degrowth by then will be unexpected, retroactive, and we don't know if it will work. Meaning by then, we will encounter irreversible harms that gravely affect the lives of individuals. This also means that negative cannot co-opt by saying we will do these things in bits and pieces. There will be a collective action problem on negative, because if not done consistently, the actions can offset the absence of other actions. For all these reasons and more, side affirmative.
I think the speaker with a fine speech, not open the cash. First nag, you hear.
Cool, just checking I'm audible.
Yep.
Right. few points of setup, then I'm going to bring 3 points to the house today. Firstly, the immediate harms that this policy will incur and the chance of catastrophe that will result. Secondly, the harms, even if this policy is successful in the best way that this affirmative team wants. And finally, how this policy actually reduces your capacity to do things like fight climate change or any of the good sorts of outcomes that Team Affirmative might want. Firstly, on setup though. Firstly, a question on fiat. So this is a that we should motion, which means it is a fiat motion. In the status quo, there aren't these trends that this affirmative team outlines. But in the interest of the debate, like even if it's not a fiat motion, that doesn't matter, right? Like our points are still going to stand. But what we would say is that this policy requires heaps of popular support and thus fiat, right? That is firstly because it's unprecedented, completely in opposition to what everyone has always thought. Secondly, because it does just put people out of jobs and, stop people consuming the things they want. And thirdly, because people often do just prioritize their own individual economic needs over things like climate change, which means that it's going to be something that they wouldn't support prima facie. That means we have more ability to do things that might be good for stopping climate change or good for, reducing the sort of hustle culture that they want on their side of the house. What does that look like? It looks like more money for massive investments into renewable energy and efficient technology. It looks like being able to beef up standards and regulations on the most bad polluters. And it looks like having, more on climate. Spending more on climate change mitigation and loss and damage in the developing world. The second thing I would note, though, is that this affirmative team must rely on aiming for a decrease in growth. They can't aim for stability. They can't aim for just getting rid of overconsumption. They have to aim for a decrease of growth into the long term. That means it must go down. We're going to say there's a huge amount of harms that happen. So firstly, what are the immediate harms and chance of catastrophe? And I would note that this point and the harms I'm about to outline stand even if you have the best financial planners and capacity to do it in the West, even if you have the best incentive not to screw it up, these things are still going to happen. The first and the most crucial is economic panic. That is because the underlying assumption behind all of capitalism, the entire economic system under which we work, is that growth will increase. That is why people invest in the stock market, because they think they're going to get a return on their investment as growth increases. So what happens when you say now, well, we're going to target not growth, when we're going to make sure that growth goes down? Of course, you have no incentive as an investor to stay in the stock market because you think you're going to lose all the money on your stock. Right? So everyone is going to immediately pull out of the stock market and importantly, stay out of the stock market, right? It's not going to rebound because there's no promise that it will go up in the worst case, in the best case. What are the harms of that? Firstly, people just lose their life savings. And importantly, that includes everyone with their pensions or their 401ks invest in the stock market. It's not just big corporate investors. But secondly, companies lose a whole bunch of capitals. They can't do things like invest in green technology. And I would note that this point occurs even if this policy is done gradually and done in a measured way, because that underlying assumption still changes that actually stocks aren't going to go up, and that would actually be quite bad for your own investment. People hoard their own money. You don't get capital influx into the economy. Secondly, it will create a deflationary spiral, which will mean that the value of aggregate demand in the economy just tanks. And that is something that is super easy, notoriously, to get out of control, like you have seen in Japan before. Importantly, the mechanism here is people start saving their money, because if they think their money is going to increase in value as there's less investment into the economy in the long term, that means they've got more and more of an incentive over time to save their money. That means the value of the currency exponentially goes up and, deflation exponentially increases, so you get huge unemployment harms that hurt low-income workers the most. The third definite harm that you'll get is people losing the faith in their government. And that leads to things like increase in civil unrest. That means you get less compliance with the sorts of economic policy this team proposes. And I'll deal with their material here about cultural trends or progressive understandings of the world or pro-democracy parties by saying, firstly, it's unclear whether this is true, right? There's been a recent rise in far-right politics across the developed world. But secondly, that this is just such a radically different policy than anything that has been proposed before. Like, how do you sell the idea that getting poorer is something that will be good for you? Many people just will resist that narrative. And I would note that this means even if they achieve lower growth on their side of the house, they don't achieve it in the way that is optimal. They achieve it in a way that is catastrophic and uncontrollable. That means you get widespread unemployment. It means you don't have the ability to provide welfare payments to people who need it. It means you don't have any capacity to reverse the permanency of this change. So, secondly, I want to talk about the harms if this policy is successful. So assume everything I just said was wrong, and you get a gentle planned decline in the best way possible. Why is that still harmful? Firstly, because it necessarily requires an increase in things like unemployment. And importantly, it's likely to be structural unemployment in industries that are likely to be higher emitters or industries that aren't, as adapted to a 4-day work week or something, right? And that means people in certain areas don't have the skills to retrain and get another job. They are left literally reliant on this welfare payment that increases costs on the government a whole lot more. Secondly, you have a widespread decrease in living standards across the world. That is because you have less capital or incentive for companies to do things like invest in vaccines or literally just provide the products that people need to live their lives. And notably, that affects the poorest in societies the most, right? Because they are often the ones with, firstly, low-wage, minimal labor jobs that are dependent on emissions that will be unemployed first. Secondly, because they're often priced out of cities, so they lose access to public transport they would need. But thirdly, because they don't have as much of a safety net as richer people would do. The third key harm, even if you're successful, is you reduce your tax revenue. And that particularly undermines the safety net of welfare that this affirmative team relies on. That is to say, even if you have a bigger percentage of tax, there is less net taxable income in the economy because investment has decreased. That means you have less money in the government's coffers that they can spend on the sorts of policies this affirmative team wants. But fourthly, and importantly, this particularly hurts developing nations. And this co-op's the most important material from side affirmative. That is for a few reasons. Firstly, because supply chains just get screwed over, right? Because every company who now just has to shut down because of the disinvestment incentives that you've provided now is no longer employing all the workers in the developing world that made up their supply chain. That's huge onshore shocks in terms of those jobs that those people have. Secondly, these developed nations have less capacity or incentive for foreign direct investment. That means they're not going to help those countries who need it. But thirdly, you're more likely to adopt more protectionist policies, particularly in the long term. That might mean things like immigration caps if you want to ensure that growth stays down. What does the affirmative team say? They say there's overconsumption, there's too much work in less economically developed countries. But we say we can regulate to that some extent. But more importantly, it's worth a trade-off. We think most people in the developing world would prefer to have a job than be left isolated by this policy, even if there are benefits in the long term. Then they say, well, even if it doesn't work, it's good to see what would happen. I say that's wrong. I think it's better to not risk economic collapse at that point. Weigh this material against, harms of climate change or something like that. Maybe it happens a little slower, but that is that we have certain harms for millions of people. Suffering like homelessness in developed countries is still suffering, but it also affects less economically developed countries. Affirmative team just doesn't provide an outcome for those people to securely keep their jobs, keep their livelihoods. Thirdly, let's just preempt some material that might come out about climate change, noting that it wasn't even a central part of this affirmative case. Firstly, the fiat stuff I said earlier. Secondly, the tax revenue stuff I said earlier. You have less tax revenue you can spend on good solutions to climate change. Thirdly, you just nuke private investment into green technology on their side of the house. That is to say, even if they're able to get more targeted investment in those sorts of technologies, there's less total capital available to those companies since they're not able to invest in the technology you need. Fourthly, developing countries will develop slower as a result of having less, employment from foreign direct investment and stuff, which means they spend more time in the industrialization phase where there is larger emissions. But finally, just less economically developed countries are often reliant on tech transfer from the West. You nuke the capacity of them to stop climate change at that point as well. Look, to the extent that some climate change happens on either side of the house, we have much more capacity to invest in mitigation on our side of the house for all of those reasons. Not only will this screw everyone over in the short term and the long term, it doesn't achieve any of the aims that affirmative wants.
I think the speaker for the fine speech now takes in the case for second half.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Hello?
I think you lagged a bit, but nonetheless, I think your audio is clear.
Yeah, just
Hello, am I audible? Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're clear.
Hold on. I'll just plug this laptop in because it's about to be low back. Okay. So I'm plugged in right now. Just gonna set up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with the previous speaker is that it ignores a large amount of the analysis coming from first affirmative as to why it is going to be done in a way that's gradual and ultimately just brushes it off as even at the best case, it's still not going to happen without providing any substantial reason as to why that is the case. First,
Hi.
there are many incentives from the state in a way that's gradual. Hold on. Did someone unmute?
Sorry. I'm not sure if it's only on my end, but the internet on your end is red bar. Okay. Thank you so much for the confirmation. You could just restart your speech. You started getting laggy for like 5 to 10 seconds.
Okay. Can I just confirm if I'm audible now?
Is it fine if you could try to read the motion just to get confirmation?
This house that we should support, that we should implement a degrowth policy in developed countries.
Yeah, it's clear. In any case, we do suggest that you could perhaps it's clear now. You could proceed.
Okay, I'll just restart my speech. Starting my speech again in 3, 2, 1, go. The folly of first negative is that it ignores a large amount of analysis from first affirmative as to why this is going to be done in a way that is gradual and it is possible for us to do so. The fact that first affirmative pointed out that not simply the state, but also the people on the ground have the incentive to want to make sure that it's done in a way that is slow. As you can see, you're going to lose your job. That the next day, we're not going to help you because we want to pursue this policy of degrowth. Insofar as this
Hi. Really sorry again to cut off, but second half.
just simply the any
Because the marker.
Hold on, is it still choppy?
Yeah, this time it was a bit far worse. You were laggy for like 10 to 15 until you were able to hear us. Perhaps the solution is if it's fine to turn off the camera. Perhaps it's serving the internet connection.
Yeah, hold on. I'll just try to also move to another spot. Maybe it's because this part of the house has bad connection.
Alright.
I'll also just get my laptop. My notes are there. Okay, am I audible now?
Yeah.
All right. I'm sitting on the floor now. I'm also really sorry again for the delays. This is unprecedented. Should I restart my speech?
Yes, it was only the first 30 seconds, so you could restart.
Okay. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The folly of first negative and the negative bench in general is simple. They're largely unresponsive to a large amount of the claims coming from first affirmative as to why this is going to be done in a way that is gradual. We pointed out that there's incentives from not just simply the state, but also the people to want to make sure that it's done in a way that is slow in order for us to ensure that we're able to adapt towards the needs of the people. It's the fact that we can do things to communicate with people to figure out what's the best solution for them and what's the best solution of the state so that we can ultimately come to a compromise. Insofar as first negative says that at best it is not possible on our side just simply brushing it off without providing any substantial reason as to why it is not possible on our side, beyond just simply claiming it's not going to be possible, then this case still stands for first affirmative. And insofar as first negative and negative bench in general is premised on the assumption on an unreasonable understanding of our side, then they clearly lose this debate. Two things in my speech. Firstly, is a series of rebuttals that ultimately backs up the comparative of my partner. And secondly, flipping social welfare and proving why social welfare, even if it's something that's important, is still far better on the our side. Firstly, just a set of rebuttals against the immediate harms that they want to posit. The first thing I got to respond to is this whole point about unprecedented, the fact that it's unprecedented, and the fact that we're going to lose a large amount of jobs on the our side. Two responses. One, this doesn't respond to first affirmative setup, that this can be done in a way that is gradual in the first place. There are three things I want to point out here. A, so we can communicate with various industries, unions, and etc., so that we can get a general consensus on how fast we should do this. Like, for instance, if people are currently afraid of the fact that they may like lose jobs, for instance, we can set contracts so that we can easily transfer these people to other industries, do things like retraining, so that in the long term we're able to transfer these people away from industries, for instance, that cause a large amount of damage to the environment, that cause a large amount of overworking in the first place. And we can ensure that these people are still able to have employment. It is possible under our side. Note that they cannot try to co-opt this because it's only possible in degrowth. Secondly, we can also do things like report this in the media as something that they are planning to do slowly rather than something that they're doing rapidly, so we can ease the tensions of people. But thirdly, that is already supported in the status quo, as we pointed out. People want less working days, right? People want all of these kinds of things. So it's something that people are going to support at the end of the day. So ultimately, a large amount of the claims coming from our negative bench as to why it's not going to be done in a way that's gradual, ultimately is uncomparative or unengaging. But the second response is this. I want to point out that people will not pull out of stock markets or banks. Not that they don't analyze this, especially because it's relying on an understanding of our model that's incredibly disingenuous. Because people rely on banks to keep their money safe. They're not going to pull out just because they see that this policy is something that's going to be passed. But two, that often people who invest in stock markets are people who observe trends, for instance. So if they observe that the industry is slowly starting to become less and less good, then they're going to slowly shift a large amount of the stocks to other industries, and etc. So ultimately, it's not going to be a massive pullout from all industries, for instance, or from all banks. We're able to do this in a way that's particularly gradual, in a way that's particularly slow. So in terms of this being unprecedented and losing jobs, we don't think that that's necessarily the case. But the second thing I want to engage with is on the idea of being able to cater towards green tech. Two responses. One, this is symmetric at best. What we are able to do under our side, and what we clearly pointed out, is that insofar as we reduce things like consumption and etc., we're cutting down on doing things like, for instance, creating vanity projects, like building a bunch of stadiums and etc. And instead, the money that goes to these vanity projects instead goes to green tech. It is actually under our side that we increase the capacity to develop, because instead of, essentially, because we're the ones who actually increases a large amount of taxes on industries that pollute the earth, on industries that ultimately damage the environment. So we're able to ensure that we increase taxes on things like oil, for instance, and redirect all of those taxes to green tech development and etc. But the second response is this. Let's say in the worst case that we cannot have as much green tech under our side compared to negative bench. Why is it that the reduced consumption under our side is still far better than even the best case under negative bench that they're able to get green tech? Because firstly, there's a visibility, right? It's far easier for people to see the benefits of reduced consumption towards the environment because of how immediate it is. That for instance, in the pandemic, we had a large amount of news reports that talked about how the ozone layer became a lot better because people were riding less cars, compared to green tech, which oftentimes takes a time for us to be able to understand the impacts or the effects of it, because it's still experimental at the end of the day. This is crucial for ensuring sustainable support. The only way by which people are able to see the benefits of the environment is if they're able to see a decrease in the statistics of carbon emissions and etc., that they're able to see clear skies, for instance, and it's only present on their our side, compared to green tech that people cannot even imagine or cannot even fathom to be what it looks like and etc. But the second reason as to why reduced consumption is better than green tech, so this is the second layer of weighing, is in terms of it being assured. We're not sure if green tech is effective yet. It is still going to take years upon years for us to be able to see the benefits of a large of our experiments. At least with our side, when it comes to being able to prioritize reduced consumption, there's already a large amount of research that suggests that lower consumption is better. Like, for instance, the pandemic example I already pointed out. This is important because climate change is urgent. You have to choose the most urgent solutions in order for us to be able to prevent a large amount of the things that climate change is doing right now. It's the fact that we have a deadline with regards to being able to reduce temperatures. It's the fact that there are many harms that are associated with climate change. Like, for instance, a large amount of farmers losing their jobs in India because of the weather conditions leading to, less crop yields. It's the fact that these kinds of weather conditions are worse, especially in the Philippines, where a large amount of floods ultimately destroy homes, ultimately prevent people from being able to live their lives and having to rebuild their lives every time floods happen, and it's starting to increase at a much more frequent rate precisely because of this overconsumption. So you have to weigh all of the benefits of being able to ensure that employment maybe exists within developed countries towards developing countries literally suffering from floods, from losing their houses, from constantly not being able to produce enough crops in order for these farmers to be able to have jobs in the first place. That is the harm that they have to weigh off in this debate. The last thing I want to point out is that it harms developing countries. This is already similar to my point about how this is already responded to when I already pointed out how it's not going to be done in a way that's unprecedented. Again, it doesn't respond to gradual development. As private companies, for instance, from developed countries downsize. Private companies from developing countries are able to seep in and like fill in the gap that these private companies ultimately left out on, precisely because we're able to reduce the consumption, or we're able to reduce rather the amount of production that these private companies does. This is actually a good thing because we're able to prevent things like monopolies from Western companies from entrenching themselves further within the status quo. On to the second part of my speech on how we're able to flip social welfare. So they might impact, or they might argue that they're able to ensure social welfare under their side. We're going to prove it's why it's better under our side. So the premise of this is simple, right? Generally, a large number of the conditions that necessitate us to have social welfare, like health, for instance, or like being able to have cheaper rent, for instance, is tied to growth that negatively affects people in the first place. So it is actually negative bench that causes a large amount of people to A, become incredibly stressed because of 6-day work weeks, which requires them to be able to have therapists, for instance, which requires them to have healthcare because they have to protect themselves. It's B, that eating too much as a result of overconsumption and the advertisement from companies to overconsume that increases chances of sickness, like health disease, for instance, like diabetes and etc. But thirdly, the environmental damage that ultimately causes people to constantly lose their house, just why necessarily they need this kind of welfare. This is worse than the negative bench insofar as A, a lot of the harms that come from overconsumption are irreversible. Progressive diseases, like for instance, health diseases, get worse. Some places are hard to rebuild houses on because of environmental damages. But furthermore, it becomes worse because these harms are scaled to a far larger extent. You have to pay a large amount of these extra expenses, plus the fact that these people are going to be rendered unproductive due to sickness means that you're not able to use these people to produce any more things under your side. It's the fact that at least under our side, you don't need to pay as much welfare regardless if they're already healthy in the first place and states are more prepared. What is the conclusion, therefore? What our side does is preemptively reduce the need for them to spend on things like welfare and status quo, insofar as people are going to be healthy either way, or people are going to be protected. This is a good thing because one, in the long term, that means that the state has more savings so that they can allocate welfare much better in the future. So they have more savings in terms of being able to develop better things so that it can make society better. But sadly, that in the short term, as stated by First Affirmative, we're able to have people be capable of being able to, find other ways by which they can find employment, find other ways by which they can make themselves happy, and explore other options that they ultimately have. In conclusion, what is clear under our side? Firstly, it's only under our side that we're able to ensure that climate change is irreversible and we're able to deal with climate change. This is not possible under their side. But secondly, that we're able to ensure that these people are able to have better welfare themselves because they're not being overworked. But thirdly, then I want to point out that so far, the bench has been incredibly uncharitable towards my First Affirmative, towards how we set up our case and the large amount of the analysis that we're able to introduce. And so far, it's too late for second negative to respond to it. And this is still standing from First Affirmative. We massively take this debate. Thanks.
Thank the speaker for the fine speech. Now to extend the case for neg. Second neg, you hear.
Just give me a second to set up my pictures and all that sort of stuff. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The entire premise of this affirmative case is that it is impossible to decouple economic growth from increases in emissions and damage to the climate. We prove categorically at will that that is untrue. We on side negative are still capable of resolving issues with the climate. So do not let them lie to you and push you that this is just a debate about trading off damage to the economy and people's lives in the developed world against harms to the climate and that affects the developing world. We fix both issues. What they do is, one, ruin developed countries' economies and hurt people in massively important ways, and two, massively reduce the capacity of the world to fix climate change and resolve those issues as well. On every front, side negative is ahead. Firstly, then, I'm going to address the issue of climate, which weirdly for the affirmative team seems to be the issue they seem to care the least about. We give you a number of reasons why it is that we have greater capacity on our side to resolve the climate, to which we hear very little response at second affirmative. Firstly, we explained to you that we have much greater fear for the very simple reason that the affirmative team's case is just like reducing the size of the economy, is making people's lives materially worse and is harming individuals, which means that they are unlikely to support it. Comparatively, things like extra investment in renewable energy, things like expanding the economy in efficient ways, funding efficiency and funding things like recycling and all of those sorts of things, they're far more likely to support. Their only response to this is people need to see a reduction in emissions in order to believe that it's possible. Firstly, this is symmetric because obviously investing in renewable energy would reduce emissions, and investing in things like more efficient use of resources would reduce emissions, meaning that we similarly see those kinds of reductions as well. But secondly, the reason why this is untrue is just because people care far more about their individual livelihoods, because whilst climate change is something that they care about on a principled level, the material impacts on them are firstly very far off into the future, and secondly, often quite small because they live in countries where the capacity to mitigate the impact of climate change is quite large, meaning that they care primarily about their living standards. And if reducing climate change comes at the cost of their living standards, they're far more likely to prioritize their living standards over any sort of reduction in emissions, which explains to you why it is that we have capacity and incentive to massively increase the amount of investment in climate change and resolve those issues far greater than they do. But then we give a whole bunch of responses to which they have no response at second affirmative. Firstly, we say that you have less tax revenue for the reason that now, whilst you may be targeting taxes on like things like inefficient industries, but you have less taxable income on a whole because GDP goes down, which means you have less things to tax. Secondly, we explain that you get less private investment because there's less trust in the economy. Fourthly, we explain to you that developing countries begin to develop slower, which means because you get less investment in them, which means that you get them reducing emissions at greater rates for a longer period of time. And fifthly, we explain to you that there's less transfer of technology from the developed countries to developing countries, which means that they get less efficient, which means that you get much more emissions. For all of those reasons, we are clearly ahead on climate change. Next, let's talk about whether this will be done well, which is the main push we hear from second affirmative. They explained firstly that they have capacity to do this well because they have good economic experts and lots of technology in order to make economic models that will predict how this will impact things. Firstly, empirically, it's just untrue that developed countries are consistently perfect economic planners. Look at, for example, all the countries that experience massive economic shocks during things like economic crises. Look at countries like Greece, which consistently seem to fail despite having access to experts in producing good economic planning. Look at countries that make mistakes all the time. Just because you have economic experts doesn't mean you make perfect economic decisions all the time. That should prove to you that it's possible this will be done poorly. But secondly, we explain to you that it's not just possible this will be done poorly, but likely, for the reason that this is a novel economic concept. Therefore, experts are unlikely to implement this extremely well, even if they do have access to good technology, and even if they do have access to important data, it's still untrue that they have experience in implementing this kind of economic policy. But thirdly, we explain to you that even if it were true that governments are capable of doing this well, that's not important because the most important thing is that investors believe the government is going to do this well. But the issue is most investors are hesitant of big government changes in policy, which means they pull out of the economy when the government is engaging in massive policy shift, especially where the policy shift is deliberately towards economic degrowth, which means that you get investors who want to manage their risk and minimize the risk of losing assets, pulling out of the economy, pulling out of the stock market. They claim to you at second affirmative that they will just move their stocks from inefficient areas of the economy into things like renewable resources. But firstly, it's much more likely that they just pull out of the stock market entirely, invest in other kinds of things that the government isn't messing with, for example, investing in like the property market, for example. And secondly, it's more likely they pull out of funds entirely. For example, people pull their savings out of retirement funds because they don't trust economic managers to go through this period of time. And even if they could invest more in things like renewable resources, that is only true to an extent. At some point, enough investors are invested in those kinds of renewable resources. And because the economy as a whole is going down, that means investors are going to pull out. Fourth reason then why this is done, don't have the capacity to do this well, is because inescapably, what you are doing is bad. Even if you slowly decrease the size of the economy, you are still decreasing the size of the economy. What they are planning well is a deliberate shrinking of the economy, which necessarily incurs the kinds of economic harms we explained to you at will. Next claim they make is that you have the incentive to do this well, because you don't want massive economic shocks, and even right-wing parties have some incentive to do this well. First issue with this is maybe the people who are engaging in this policy, for example, the party in power, have incentive to do this well, but there are a variety of other actors that have incentives to make this done poorly. Firstly, for example, opposition parties that are skeptical of climate change, like the Republican Party, is unlikely to support the implementation of this, is instead likely to put roadblocks in the way, make sure that this is best for companies and not best for individuals. But secondly, it looks like corporations who actively seek out ways to exploit the system and ensure that they come off the best, which means that you're unlikely to see this done in an extremely efficient way, but you're also extremely likely to see this done in a way that hurts the poorest people the most. But secondly, it's unclear that even governments who are in power consistently have perfect incentives. That's firstly because they care significantly less about poor people, because they're often democratically less represented, meaning they don't have as much democratic incentive to care about them as they do about higher income people. But secondly, it's because they don't care about the developing world, because they aren't directly accountable to individuals in the developing world, which means that when they plan this economic policy, maybe they will plan it well for middle and high income people, but they're unlikely to plan it particularly well for poor people who matter most in the debate for the reasons that we'll explain. At the end of that, what does this mean? Firstly, you should weigh all of those economic substantive, which is almost entirely unresponded to, super highly, because even if this is planned super well, you still incur all of those impacts. And secondly, you should believe that the worst economic impacts that Will explains are in fact likely to occur, because even with their mechanisms for capacity and incentive, unclear that this gets done well. Moving on then, why is it that this degrowth is actually extremely harmful for people economically? First characterization thing they push is a characterization that the West is simply too grind-set pill. They overconsume and just are greedy. Firstly, this characterization is simply cartoonish and is never actually proven, neither through substantive or through empirical fact. In fact, we push a counter-characterization, which is the West doesn't just like massively consume unnecessarily. Not every single person in the West just has a fridge full of rotting food. Many individuals in the West are on minimum wage, are suffering, are living day by day, are in fact dependent on things like welfare. They aren't just over-consuming and buying cheap goods, which means that we should care about their economic incentives. And reducing growth likely hits those individuals the most. It doesn't mean that high-income people now try and save money by buying less food and not engaging in as much food waste. What it probably means is people who are already on minimum wage, already struggling, in fact don't have enough food in the fridge, now have even less money and become even more economically desperate. Second push they give us is that this is bad for the developing world because they are forced to engage and match the West when they're extracting resources from their own country. First issue with this is you don't actually change the incentive for consumption in the West. You don't actually make people want goods any less than they do in the status quo. Instead, what you do is just make those goods more expensive, which means people turn to ulterior goods, for example, ones that are much cheaper. That means whereas a person who's a middle income individual would otherwise have purchased from some level of sustainable fashion, now turns to companies like ASOS who produce goods overseas at extremely cheap prices. If you make people much poorer, they turn to unsustainable versions of consumption rather than sustainable versions of consumption, which means in fact the resource extraction and labor extraction in developing countries gets much greater. But secondly, nobody from the West is forcing developing countries to engage in labor or engage in resource extraction. Their growth in tandem with the West has been extremely beneficial for them. It's lifted millions of people out of poverty and improved their lives substantially. Finally, they push that it's better for developed countries because now they have to work less, insulting to every single poor and middle class person in the West. The culture shift they talk about is totally speculative, and it's not a problem with consumption. We just have a problem with inefficient consumption. For these reasons, very, very proud of the game.
I think the speaker for a fine speech. That summarize the case for affirmative. Third act, speaker.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, I guess. I think it's plus 4 hours there. It's afternoon. Can I ask if I am audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Wait, I just need to. Sorry. Not sorry. I'm not writing one. Okay. speech start in 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. I want to note that if the comparative of neg is one where people will give more money to green tech, companies would want to insure as a feature and cover harms, then their own rebuttals stand against it. Because if they said that people are not likely to pursue degrowth on our side because of individual interest, their side also presupposes or requires individuals to backseat their individual interest, because that money going into green tech could have been to direct welfare for them, could have been their money that they could have personally spent by themselves. But also to just weigh this off, where are more individuals more likely to spend or be willing to go into sustainable initiatives? One where not only is the future speculative, because they say green tech works, but if I want to post for for nuclear technology, we're still not sure if it's the same efficiency as coal and oil. In any actual green alternative, they're still under potential compared to oil still, and we don't know if we'll be able to have the same efficiency. Anyway, if we're looking about technology but carbon capture, that's also still experimental technology, and that's still down the road that we're not sure. Even if we put as much money into it, it will come to fruition, because that's not how technology works. Doesn't mean that you put so much money into it means that it will come into fruition, but it just means that you are going to pursue it anyway. All of these things are speculative and neg, and therefore you have to side with AF, because only us are able to prove the analysis and also the impacts of these things. There are 3 issues that I'll have in the speech. Firstly, will this be done well? Secondly, on developing nations, and lastly, on developed countries. Firstly, will this be done well? And I want to point out, if second next qualm is that it will be planned on the
Hi, sorry to
if you're correct, and that means how rich people out.
sorry to interrupt. Yeah,
Sorry.
Wi-Fi connection is a bit wonky again. We stopped the timer. You currently stopped nearing the 2 minutes, so you could just resume your speech.
Okay, so I have 6 minutes. What was my last word?
Your last word was when you're talking about expanding on your first issue.
Okay. Sorry, like when I was talking about my first issue, or what my first issue will be?
You were going to specify. We're already able to enumerate the 3 things.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Speech continue in 3. Oh, sorry. Before that, since like I'm restarting my timer, can you please just ask for a timestamp if ever, just so like
Yep.
timestamps if I'm already at 7, or just so I can approximate it as well. Okay. Thank
Yep.
you.
No problem.
Speech continue in 3, 2, 1. Will it be done well? Because if neg says that, oh, it will be construed to how the rich want it, firstly, this is not true, because if your characterization is that the vast majority of people who will also be affected are ones who rely on welfare, that is not going to happen because they have more voting power. Secondly, if it does happen, then I'm not sure how your other harms, such as them pulling out of the stock market, them not going to go and invest anymore, because does happen, because these rich people were able to form the policies into what they want, and therefore have less reason to be scared of to begin with. But let's proceed to the other things, and let's be charitable anyway. Firstly, on the stock market, one, even if they have degrowth, these are just one of the most secure markets in the world. Secondly, even if there's degrowth, there's still a big amount of growth. It's just the fact that if the United States cuts down from 20% growth to 10% growth, that's literally twice than most countries out there. Secondly, they said that people will overly save. One, individuals still have expenditures. They have to spend money on food, clothes, medicine, and whatnot. So presumably, there's still this amount of spending going around. But secondly, we said that it's still be going, that they still have a means of taxation. If not, there's even more, because you can now tax more oil and coal on our side, more luxury goods that tends to target unnecessary spending to begin with. But thirdly, they said that on our side, investments are going to go into things like the housing market and such. I want to point out that this was asserted, but also the rebuttal here is that because most like some industries are going to be not supported by the government anymore, the intuitive thing for them to do is to actually go into industries with the assured consumption. Therefore, it's on our side where companies will invest into green tech, companies will invest into medicine and vaccines, because this is one where there's assured consumption, versus on their side where, because the government still supports any type of consumption, we're not sure if their companies will go into vaccines or they will go into cosmetic surgery or like youth cells that don't actually benefit the masses, but they're enterprises that we still allowed to continue insofar as growth literally welcomes all types of industries to begin with. But last thing I want to ask, are we going to have to pursue degrowth anyway? And explain yes, right? Because the rate of growth that you have now is unsustainable. Individuals are already getting exhausted. So many individuals are getting sick. Climate disaster isn't something that is plaguing developing countries, guys. Australia is literally burning. The East Coast in the United States is already flooding, and UK is already experiencing a lot of smog. So I want to weigh this off. Firstly, in terms of abruptness, it is on their side where it's more abrupt, because the point in which they will have to degrowth is one where they were unable to plan, and therefore the harms of negative does happens. Compared on our side where we already chose to start now, we already had the planning. They can't make this comparative to crises, because crises are something that no country has actually like tried planning to have. Like no country said that we will plan the financial crisis in 2008. Those were things that were unexpected. Secondly, in terms of massive harms, it is on their side where they have to wait until they devastated more lives, where they can't reverse climate change, and health conditions of individuals have gotten progressively worse. But lastly, in terms of reversibility, it is on their side where it's already reversible, because even if we try to pursue degrowth in the future, we're unsure if we can solve it at that point in time. It is already going to be too late. So I think the first issue, one, the conclusion is that it will be able to be done well. But secondly, even if there are some mistakes down the line, even if there's some risks down the line, it is better now than in the future where we have less control and all of the neg harms does happen. The second issue I want to talk about is harming developed nations. And the first thing I want to point out is we explain this is not need, but it is excess. It is the fact that the United States consumes food that can fill up into 10 stadiums of food waste. But secondly, in how the electricity consumption in Australia, for example, is twice that of Southeast Asia, even though they're just the fifth of our total population. This presumes that even if they do consume less, means that they're still able to get their needs, when in other parts of the world, people literally make do with even more less. But secondly, is to ask, do we need more funding for welfare? And NEC only assumes that we need a lot of funding for welfare, but it is from after we're able to mechanize why we need less. Because on NEC's side, it is on their side where you need to spend more when more individuals get progressive diseases, when more individuals have diabetes, heart problems, need to use house insurance because they get floods more often. What is the way off to this? The first is on our side, it is less money spent because we preempt a lot of these things. But secondly, we inevitably need to fund insurance because some individuals get flooded, some individuals get diabetes and cancer. The difference is there's less cases of this happening compared to Muneg, wherein they're happening all simultaneously. So at the end of the day, we're able to save developed countries better. But lastly, I want to talk about harming developing nations. They say that you restrict immigration. One, no, it doesn't happen because a lot of developed countries have aging populations and therefore it's still a necessity. Secondly, it's aligned with degrowth because oftentimes immigrants are more tolerant of lesser pay because even if the pay is lesser, the stronger currency means that it is still far more than what they would have gotten in their home countries. But thirdly, even if I would say this is a good thing because developing nations suffer from brain drain because all the professionals go to developed countries and therefore are unable to give their skills, are unable to give their talents, and therefore a lot of industries aren't able to develop. It is on our side where we actually restrict immigration and therefore distribute a lot of these talent compared to NEG where they're all hoarded because they would want to pursue unlimited growth even though it's unneeded, means that a lot of developing countries are left behind. Secondly, in terms of needs, jobs and needs. One is we explain that they're still likely to consume a lot. And if it's true that some individuals would probably want to spend more, even with government actions that are taking in place, that means it's just a countervailing balance. But secondly, the point wasn't that they lose jobs. It's just the fact that they aren't subjected to bad practices because they don't need to keep up with that unlimited amount of demands. It's the fact that you don't have to produce 1,000 pieces of garments every day because there's less in consumption and therefore you only have to do 500. It's not about having no jobs and a job. It's about having a humane job versus an inhumane one. But lastly is that if it's true what negative 2 says that you are going to consume in other companies, those companies are from developing countries and therefore we're actually able to feed their growth more compared to if we just feed from H&M and Zara. Last thing is in foreign direct investment. So it's true what Neg 1 and Neg 2 says that companies and investors won't go because it's negative growth, then that would suggest that they would go into investing in developing countries because it is them who are in positive growth. It is actually negative that entrenches riches to the riches of the countries while the poorest are left behind because they don't care about need at this point. They care about excess and they care about getting more. For all those reasons and more, we're very proud to propose.
I think the speaker filled fine speech. Now to summarize the case for negative, third neg here.
Our third speaker is just going to the bathroom. He'll be back shortly.
All right, sorry for the delay. Start my speech. The first question I'm going to ask in this speech is whether or not this policy is likely to be implemented well, noting that the affirmative team make this debate incredibly hard for themselves by saying, well, there's a bunch of reasons it'll be done well. If we prove that it will not, we immediately win the debate because all of our harms come to fruition, all of their benefits immediately fall out of the debate. They give us three reasons. The first is that, well, politicians and people in charge of these countries have incentives to do it well. But there are two problems with this. Firstly, incentives that politicians often run the other way. You have incentives to do popular things, not pursue policies that actively hurt the living standards of your constituents. We would suggest that to the extent that there is an incentive, it is one that runs in the opposite direction in this debate. But secondly, incentives are not enough. Politicians have incentives to win every election forever with 100% of the vote. Clearly, you need to also prove capacity of these politicians in these countries to implement it well, which this affirmative team completely failed to do. What do they actually tell us about capacity? These are the second two reasons they give us. The first is that you will use expert advice. But there are three problems with this. Firstly, as we tell you, the experts that you have been relying on have been trained in the paradigm of economic growth being a broadly desirable goal, reducing unemployment being a good thing. You are asking them to go back on decades of economic literature and expertise and to pursue a policy which until now had been anathema to them. Obviously, they're going to be very bad at this. They're going to be very inexperienced. You're going to have to rely on a bunch of cranks who actually have not had much economic influence before. Secondly, we note that the data these countries use is often wildly inaccurate. Take the US Census, for example, which regularly undercounts population by to the tune of tens of millions of people, which means that governments don't have accurate information about where to put a jobs retraining center. They don't know how many people are going to be put out of business if they shut down a particular industry. They're going to make poor decisions. But thirdly, we note that even if you do have good experts and good information, economies of nations are huge and notoriously hard to model. Central banks, governments, think tanks all get it wrong all the time. Look at what the European Union did during the global financial crisis, for instance, when they spectacularly shat the bed by implementing austerity measures, even though it was a bad thing. Governments are not flawless actors, so which means their capacity to make good decisions and implement degrowth well is very limited from the start. The final thing they tell us about why this will be implemented well is that, well, governments can just message it well. You'll be able to sell it to people. But this is just insane because no amount of advertising can overcome the fact that in material terms, degrowth requires people to get poorer and give up their livelihoods, to give up future increases in living standards as a consequence of economic growth, to give their children worse conditions than the one they themselves live in going forward into the future. Maybe they might want a 4-day work week, but not if it comes at the expense of their wages, at the expense of the business that they have worked for the past 30 years. This affirmative team is just unbelievably unrealistic about how this is likely to be implemented. And so what this means is you are likely to see some small mistakes as First Affirmative themselves concedes, check your notes, But those are not small mistakes and little oopsie daisies when you're dealing with national economies. They have immediate and devastating consequences on millions of people's lives. That looks like the stock market crashes we tell you about at will. That looks like a permanent increase in unemployment and decreases in living standards and structural dependence on things like welfare. It looks like massive reductions in government revenues from income taxes, corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, because income, corporate revenue, and capital gains all immediately start going into the negative. And that, importantly, means that all of their benefits largely fall out of the debate. All of our harms actualize. But I want to note importantly that this clash is actually fairly incidental to the debate because it's not the negative team's only win strategy. All of our harms still apply fully, even when degrowth is done well, because we explain that negative economic growth in and of itself is a bad thing, even if it's done slower or better. Don't let third affirmative squirrel this debate by saying it's just a slowdown and going from 20% to 10% growth. No, we tell you right back at Win-Will speech that degrowth necessarily requires going backwards. You are reducing growth, and which like second affirmative also conceded. Don't let them get away with that. The second thing I want to do in this speech is just briefly deal with the new substantive that comes out of third affirmative about degrowth being inevitable anyway as climate change ramps up. 3 reasons this is untrue. Firstly, this is completely contingent on all of our mechanisms about more investment, about more actual renewable investment and better technology being a complete failure and completely failing to deal with the problem. They never specifically prove that. Secondly, I want to note that this is just objectively untrue, right? Even if the climate situation goes as bad as you could reasonably expect, that is not going to wipe out humanity. The United States government is not going to collapse. Wall Street is still going to exist. There are still obviously going to be capitalism and growth incentives, even in the event of a total climate apocalypse. Clearly, it is unreasonable for them to suggest that degrowth will just happen down the track, so it's better get it out of the way. But thirdly, even at taking them at their best and assuming this argument makes sense, which it doesn't, we have a much wealthier and more economically robust society down the track if we allow growth to continue now, if we allow poor people to get more economic development, if we allow developing nations to get more foreign direct investment when you don't immediately hamper the growth of the entire global economy. Clearly, that is not a substantive piece of substantive that you should credit very significantly. The third thing I want to deal with in this speech then is literally the only affirmative team thing they try and concretely prove, which is that overconsumption and hustle culture are bad for people because it encourages them to work longer hours and they might get sick, and that is bad. And the way we want to defeat this is just through weight, right? We'll take them at their highest. We'll be charitable. Let's assume lots of people in the developed world now work less. Maybe that's good for their health. Maybe they get some kind of internal satisfaction out of it. But at the same time as they are working less, they are also earning less. They are consuming less useful things like medicine, but also just things they like. And they're often consuming inferior, more damaging products, as Charlie tells you in a second. They have fewer job opportunities because companies have less capacity to hire people because the aim of degrowth is to make their profits negative and make it harder for them to function. The government has less revenue to spend on welfare for them if they ever do lose their jobs. They suffer from higher prices as the global supply chain eats shit because all of these companies now shut down. They might live in an area where there are no economically viable industries. They might have to spend more on basic necessities like fuel if they live in a rural area or outside of major urban centers with good public transportation. We tell you very simply that to the extent that overconsumption is a bad thing, it is far less bad than poverty. And that is what this affirmative team would condemn millions of already struggling people to. People who already under growth, are already suffering from low minimum wage, suffering from lack of healthcare, suffering from a lack of opportunities. This affirmative team makes all of those problems worse, and they don't even fix the underlying causes of those issues. That's why they cannot win this debate at this point. Finally, let's talk about the long-term harms which we walked through in this debate. We tell you firstly, you lose a huge amount of investment capacity, especially on things like renewable energy. Second affirmative tries to claim, well, no, you actually get more investment because the government can target it now. But firstly, we'll tell you that the massive total reduction of wealth in that economy undermines all of this. Because even if you can target it more efficiently, there is just so much less that it is still comparatively worse than our world. But secondly, we tell you that it reduces the incentives for these companies and these governments to invest in the first place, because this affirmative team deliberately reduces their potential to profit off of them. They're much less willing to take risks. They're much less willing to make new ventures, which might now end up not giving them the growth they would otherwise get. And third affirmative is right. Individual self-interest still applies in our world, but negative team leverages that individual self-interest into productive, useful, socially useful investments like green energy because they can profit more from it in our world than in the affirmative team's world. That is why that push doesn't work. The affirmative team responds to this by saying, well, it's better in their world because people can see the environmental damage of consumption. But we'll tell you in setup, and it's just empirically true, when faced with a binary choice between mitigating climate change or helping their own short-term economic situation, they help themselves. They don't care about the economy. That's why you end up with things like that's exactly the problem that this affirmative team themselves identify. So clearly that won't work. So the environment only gets better on side negative when you get massive amounts of investment into good technologies. We tell you foreign direct investment crashes, which means that developing nations lose a huge amount of jobs in the global economy? They respond, well, local companies will fill the void. But how? They've got no established supply chains. They don't have wealthy consumer bases overseas. They have no capital available in that country to be able to build that up. Never explained, should not be credited. They knew at third that it fixes brain drain. But firstly, they never proved that brain drain isn't in and of itself a bad thing. We think freedom of movement is good, and remittance payments that they tell highly skilled people can send back to their country is useful. Finally, we tell you government revenue collapses because all of your sources of revenue decline. They say you need to spend less, but how? You necessarily have to increase unemployment and reduce consumption. That is why this affirmative team just cannot win this debate. They make the economy worse, and for what?
I think the speaker for a fine speech. Now to end the negatives case, reply.
Starting in 5, I'll assume I'm audible.
Yep.
This affirmative team's case relies on pointing out some problems in the status quo and the intuition pump that a lot of the examples in the info slide seem like good policies, so they might be able to reduce some of the worst parts of hustle culture or climate change. Unfortunately, this affirmative team had the burden to support a broader push towards degrowth, which meant even if individually these might be good ideas, when you do them under the policy platform this affirmative team must support, it means there are a bunch of other harms that accrue, which means that it's a clear negative victory. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, consider our quickest path to victory, which is the stock market crash. Secondly, explain whether this is even a good outcome worth aiming for. And finally, just asking whether it will be done well and talk about the additional harms we have to extend the margin if it isn't. Firstly, on the stock market crash. And the reason I'm starting here is because, as I said at first, negative, this happens independently of how well this policy is done. That is because even if you do it over a gradual period of time, even if you only change the industries of good, the overarching assumption that this affirmative team pushes into the economy is that growth will go down over the long term. And that is the biggest disincentive for anyone to ever invest. And the responses here were poor, right? It was just to say, well, the stock market is stable, but of course, they're stopping it from being stable. Well, they're saying, well, maybe you could switch from investing in oil to green stocks. But overall, the market downturns, right? Like even if a green firm would be expected to suffer in a bad economy. I'd like to weigh this material, right? Because if a large percentage of companies go bust, then there is far less capacity to employ workers for even 4 days a week, to stimulate the sort of growth in developing nations that need, or to tackle climate change using any sort of technology. That's the quickest way to give this to side negative. Secondly, though, let's ask whether this is a good outcome, even worth aiming for. Affirmative team gives 3 pushes. The first is to say there are some harms to overworking, to overconsumption like sickness. But it was never clear to me why working 6 days a week was more harmful than not having a job at all. Secondly, they explained how there was an effect of overconsumption on the workloads of the developing nations. But of course, it was voluntary, as we say, right? Like these nations want to have that employment. These people want to have jobs. And thirdly, let's talk about climate change. But this wasn't even in their case until second. We had to give it to them. And at that point, we'd already provided 5 points why it's better on our side of the house. Their only response is to say, well, green technology just doesn't work and will never work. This was firstly assertive, but secondly, we explain why it would work better on our side, when you invest in it. Compare that with the harms we outlined. Firstly, the decrease in living standards that hurts the poorest. Secondly, unemployment and massive pressures on the welfare system. Thirdly, less tax revenue and investment into things like medicines that people need. Fourthly, explaining how it hurts developing nations through supply chains, through FDI, and through protectionism. And they say that companies from those nations might fill the void, but we say that that comes at the cost of more pollution, but also that they lack the capital and the ability to do so. Weigh the certain harms that we give you here, because firstly, these harms don't fall on those who are currently over-consuming or overspending. Rather, they fall on the poorest who are struggling to get by in society in the status quo. That's where the incidence of this affirmative team's case falls. But secondly, any degrowth must necessarily result in harms such as lower living standards or unemployment. Compare that with their harms. Potentially, you have less stressed workers. Potentially, you have better climate change policy. Potentially, it is better for developing nations. So on certainty alone, you should give this to negative. Finally, will it be done well? And they say you have the incentive and capacity to do it well, but we explain that not everyone will agree. Corporate lobbyists will undermine that. They say it's symmetric, but we explain because it's a more controversial policy on affirmative side of the house, there's going to be more resistance. We also explain how it's super untested, how you lack information or the capacity to gauge how it will be done over a widespread economy. And the impacts of this were huge. Was firstly the deflationary cycle that you incur, because of course, not all saving is good if you're not investing any money in the economy. It's all the civil unrest material that we bring, but it's also the fact that all of our other harms just get far worse if they can't do their policy 100% perfectly like they want to.
I think the speaker for the final speech, to finally end the debate, Acharya, you're here.
Okay. I'm not gonna turn on my camera because I have a feeling I'll get ninja'd anyway. So
yeah.
All right. Anyway. Okay. 3, 2, 1, let's go. 3 parts to this reply speech: on capacity, on harms, and on the counterfactual. First, let's talk about capacity. The first thing that tries to get response from side negative is that we don't have means and we don't have an incentive. And I want you to notice how there isn't actually much sufficient or constructive response from first or second. But interestingly enough, third negative gives additional reasons for why we don't have means or incentive. They say people are inexperienced, data is insufficient, it's often hard to model. First, we gave reasons. Check your notes. We said, for example, that they have incentive to do this because they don't want to have scandals. It might compromise political interests, for example. There are also means and capacities, such as they have infrastructure, they have technology, they have economic advisors. The meaning and the ability for different parts of a government and of a nation to be able to plan means that you get to share that technology and those resources. On their end, it's not orchestrated, it's not organized, it's not planned. And therefore, it might be entirely true that some aspects of the environment sector or the economy sector or the labor sector may actually have to experience people being experienced and having insufficient data and technology. But the second thing they tried to discuss is on buy-in. So second negative tries to disprove this eventually by saying Republicans will put roadblocks. First of all, it's about extent. So what even are these roadblocks? I don't even know what roadblocks actually mean in this debate. And to what degree are they effective? But the second thing is, do they have the incentive to do so? We explained that while it is true that there are some Republicans that will probably put these quote-unquote roadblocks, there are Republicans and moderates who probably, for example, don't have an incentive to be staunch advocates against degrowth, and therefore, even if they're against it, they won't necessarily go to the extent of backlash and lambasting the Democratic Party or whatever. So when you discuss this on this side, we say that people will side with it, and for example, some people will somewhat side with it. So you must weigh this buy-in issue on, first of all, who gives more reasons as to whether or not people will buy into the concept of the degrowth, or second of all, who outweighs, and affirmative does both. The next thing I want to talk about is on harms. So the first few things we say are stuff about how this is bad, how growth is bad for the global and local economy, and there are social harms like people being unhappy and people working to the bone. So the first part of this is on negative, some stuff is unresponded to. We think stuff on social harms, self-actualization, spending time with your family are all benefits you can still credit to affirmative. And we think those are important because it makes people happy, for example, it makes them live more fulfilling lives. But second of all, some stuff, while responded to on neg, is not responded well. So stuff on economy, for example, the fact that a lot of people are experiencing food wastage and other things like that, they're not actually responded to. What negative does instead is to counter-argue other harms and imply that they're significantly more harmful. So this is the stuff about stock markets crashing. The first issue you have with this is a little bit extreme and outlandish. The second problem is that Apao and Alex and I, as a matter of fact, structurally preempt and respond to this. We say you can communicate with industries to ensure that you can do it in a more gradual manner. You don't have the incentive, for example, to ensure that all people pull out of the stock market. Individually, individuals might not want to pull out of the stock market because staying in the stock market is way better than pulling out and just letting your money die in the bank or die in your house, for example. Third, negative does not weigh, but implicitly or explicitly, we on affirmative suggest that the middle class and the rich will be fine. For example, negative has a collective action problem because every aspect will move on their own terms and not communicate, for example. But this third thing they do is on third negative, they give new substantive. So they say that we will have negative profit, which is just as disingenuous. There are no structural reasons. It's not even implied by the info slide. We just say that will decrease, and we were already arguing that there's too much high GDP on developed nations. So what we're just saying is that we're going to lower it. We never said that we were going to make it negative. It's not even implied as well. But they'll say they don't weigh out the green tech stuff, because what we were trying to say is, if it is true that you will still pursue green tech, that's offset by all the industrialization you you do. And again, collective action problem, you won't be able to organize and orchestrate such that, you know, the amount of green tech you make is enough to sufficiently offset the amount of emissions you make. So this is the important part of the counterfactual that they don't answer. And insofar as in the future we'll be forced to degrowth because of the climate crisis and all that, they give no explanation as to why exactly it will be done well. And all of the arguments that they say are on our side are occurring on their side to a more severe and irreversible degree. For all these reasons and more, affirmative.